Okay, let's get into this. Welcome to the deep dive. And just so you know, this particular deep dive is presented as a popular Beethoven magazine audio discussion. We're stepping right into, well, what makes Beethoven so endlessly fascinating? But maybe not the part you immediately think of.
Right, not the symphonies today.
Exactly. Forget the music for a moment if you can. We're exploring the man himself, Ludwig van Beethoven.
Yeah, we all feel the power in the music, don't we? But what about the actual person? The living, breathing, complex human who created it all. What did he even look like? How did he operate day to day?
That's the mission. And our main guide here is a really insightful article from Popular Beethoven magazine. It draws very heavily on Marion Scott's classic 1934 biography.
A foundational text for this kind of insight.
Absolutely. So today, we really want to bring his physical presence, his personal habits, and that, well, vibrant and sometimes really challenging personality to life. We'll use historical accounts, anecdotes, the real stuff.
Moving beyond the marble bust, essentially.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
Getting the full picture.
And a good starting point is understanding the source of much of this information. You mentioned Marion Scott. The article really leans on her work. She's quite a figure herself, isn't she?
Oh, definitely. Marion Margaret Scott, English violinist, a serious musicologist, a writer, lived 1877 to 1953.
And she did important work beyond Beethoven, too, right?
Yeah, significant work on Haydn. And she was a real advocate for women composers, which, wasn't exactly common back then.
But her 1934 biography, Beethoven, that's the key for us today. What made her take on him so effective, so lasting?
Well, the article points out that Scott wasn't just doing musical analysis. She did incredibly meticulous research. And her writing style is described as really vivid prose. Her aim was clearly to paint a deeply human portrait
How did she manage that?
by digging into everything. The accounts, the letters, diaries, all those little anecdotes, the things that show you the actual person, not just the composer.
And that focus on the human detail is exactly what the popular Beethoven article captures so well. So let's follow that path. Physically, what was he like? If Beethoven walked into a room, what would you see?
Well, the description Scott gathered and that the article presents, they paint a really striking picture, maybe a bit surprising. For one thing, he wasn't tall.
Oh.
No, somewhere between 160 and 165 centimeters. So what's that, about 5'2" to 5'5"?
Huh. Quite compact then.
Yeah, exactly. And his build was generally described as broad, muscular,
Mm-hmm.
stocky, really. Apparently his legs were quite short, contributing to that solid look.
Stocky build, short legs.
Right.
But wasn't there something about his torso, a contrast?
Right. While he looked stocky overall, his actual torso was considered quite fine. It suggested this underlying strength, but it was often hidden, under his rather untidy clothes.
Okay, interesting. And his hands. I mean, these are the hands that created the Moonlight Sonata, the Ninth Symphony. You'd imagine something, I don't know, elegant.
Ah, well, that's one of those fantastic contradictions we find in this deep dive. Descriptions say his hands were broad, kind of red, with short fingers.
Short fingers.
Yeah, and apparently, in daily life, they were pretty clumsy.
Clumsy. Really?
So the accounts say. But, and this is what the article really emphasizes, put those hands on a piano, and they underwent this, miraculous transformation, capable of producing music that just floored people, moved them profoundly.
Wow. So the physical tool wasn't elegant, but the connection, the artistry.
That was everything. It's a powerful image, isn't it? Clumsy in the world, absolute magic at the keyboard.
It really is. What about his face? What stood out?
His head was large. And it was dominated by this broad, noble forehead.
Yeah.
The article notes this was often called his most handsome feature.
A literal highbrow.
Huh? You could say that. His nose was also very distinct, described as square or four-cornered. Some even likened it to a lion's nose.
A lion's nose. Suggesting strength, maybe. Or forcefulness.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. Strength. His mouth was broad, his lower lip protruded just slightly, and he had this deep cleft in his chin that apparently got more noticeable as he aged.
Okay. And his teeth. Anything notable there?
Actually, yes. And it's kind of surprising for the time. His teeth were described as even and white.
White teeth. Back then, that is rare. Any idea how?
No. Sadly, the source doesn't offer any dental hygiene tips from Beethoven. Just that it was unusual enough to be noted. But okay, let's talk about the hair.
Ah, yes. The iconic wild mane.
That's the one everyone pictures, right? Just a tumbled mass. The article even mentions someone speculating about an extra charge of electricity in his body, making it stand out like that.
Extra charge of electricity. I like that. It captures that sense of energy people felt around him.
Totally. It turned steel gray later on, around 1816, and was completely white by the time he died in 1827.
And his eyes. They often get mentioned as being incredibly intense.
Definitely. Seen as his most captivating feature, possessing, quote, terrifying power.
Terrifying power. Wow.
Yeah. And the article highlights how descriptions of the color vary like crazy. Black, bluish gray, brown.
So, no consensus.
The thinking seems to be that their appearance just changed dramatically with his emotions. Probably a kind of flecked hazel gray or blue-gray base, but they'd shift depending on his mood, the intensity of the moment.
So his eyes were like a real-time emotional barometer.
Seems like it. A slightly less dramatic detail, but still part of the picture. He was short-sighted until about 1817. He actually wore glasses for a while.
Another little humanizing detail that grounds the legend a bit. Didn't the British writer John Russell describe him around that time, 1816?
He did, yeah. And Russell's description fits right in with this image of intensity and, well, disarray. He mentioned Beethoven's wild and disheveled looks, eyes full of stormy energy, and hair looking like it hadn't seen a comb or scissors for years.
Right. That really cements the image of the untamed genius. And later in life, he became even less concerned with how he looked.
Yeah, even more disheveled. Often seen in just light trousers, an old blue or green coat, maybe a low top hat pushed back on his head. He apparently owned a nicer brown coat, but the general impression is that when he was composing, or maybe just generally, appearance was way down the priority list.
Comfort and creativity first.
Seems like it. And that lack of concern for, let's say, conventional order definitely extended to his living spaces.
Oh, completely. The article quotes descriptions of his rooms as just chaotic. Manuscripts piled up everywhere, old clothes lying around, dust. Visiting him sounds like it wasn't a formal call, more like stepping into the middle of a creative whirlwind.
An adventure, as the article puts it.
Right. Okay, so we have this picture. Compact, strong, intense eyes, the wild hair, often untidy. How did that physical intensity translate into his personality, his daily habits?
Well, much like his music, his whole way of being was dynamic, often intense. He was quick in his movements, apparently, and famously impatient.
Impatient.
Yeah, especially with slowness in other people. You can kind of see how that impatience might fuel his creative drive, right? Always pushing forward.
That makes sense given the energy in his music. What about personal care? The article mentioned a kind of contradiction there, carelessness versus care.
It did. Apparently, as a schoolboy, he was pretty indifferent to dirt. Just didn't care. But when he first got to Vienna, trying to make his way, he clearly made an effort.
Oh, like how?
The article mentions he actually took dancing lessons.
Dancing lessons, Beethoven.
I know. And he'd wear fine clothes, sometimes black silk stockings, a fancy cravat given by Eleanor von Breuning.
So he could play the social game when he needed to. He could present himself.
Absolutely. But the contradiction hits when he was deep in composition. Then all that effort just vanished. He'd revert to complete disarray, totally lost in the art. Practical stuff just went out the window.
The music took over everything.
Completely. And his hygiene habits? Well, they included some pretty eccentric practices, didn't they?
They certainly did. I mean, he did wash thoroughly every morning. The article makes that clear. But when he was composing deep in thought, he had this habit, pouring water over his hands, or sometimes emptying a whole jug of cold water over his head.
Over his head, while composing.
Yes. That's what the accounts say. It gives you such a picture, doesn't it? Total immersion. Apparently, sometimes he'd soak the floor, even drip down into the apartment below.
Oh my goodness, imagine being his downstairs neighbor.
Right. And shaving. Apparently, that was also a challenge. Led to some comical mishaps.
I could just picture it. Soap everywhere.
Yeah.
And his voice.
Yeah.
Especially as his deafness got worse.
Yeah, the deafness really impacted his voice. It became loud, harsh. He lost that modulation because he couldn't hear himself properly to regulate the volume or tone.
That makes sense.
And his singing, apparently, when he tried, was just raucous. His laughter, too, described as equally loud and sometimes even somewhat frightening.
So loud, maybe unrefined sounds in his personal life. What a contrast to the intricate beauty of his music. And the deafness. We know how isolating that became.
Terribly isolating. The article mentions his reliance on those conversation books. Visitors would write down questions or comments. He'd read them and often write back his replies.
Those books are incredible historical documents, aren't they?
They really are. So poignant. They show the effort people made to connect with him, but also just how cut off he became from easy, casual conversation.
Let's dig a bit deeper into the personality itself. Beyond the habits, the appearance. What was he like, fundamentally?
Well, again, Complex, a real bundle of contradictions, you could say. On the plus side, the article points to him being genuinely humorous at times, warm-hearted, sensitive even.
But there was definitely another side.
Oh, absolutely. He could be incredibly crabby, short-tempered. His difficult nature definitely alienated people, even close friends sometimes.
The famous temper.
Exactly. And the article highlights his rebellious spirit. Interestingly, it describes him as rebelling not just against convention, but against his own weaknesses, suggesting that maybe that internal fight was part of his strength.
Fighting his own flaws to find power.
Wow.
That's a really interesting way to put it. And despite the difficult side, he was apparently quite charismatic.
Yes, seems so. Despite the gruffness, women were often quite drawn to him. And here's a funny thing. He famously hated giving piano lessons.
Right.
But the article mentions he'd make exceptions. For really talented students, naturally. Or, maybe less surprisingly, for attractive women.
Huh. There's the human element again. So definitely not just a grumpy recluse all the time. He engaged with people, even if it was complicated.
Precisely. And the anecdotes the article pulls from Scott's work really make these traits come alive. They give you these little flashes of the real person.
Okay, let's hear some. Give us some glimpses.
All right. Well, there's a great one from a party. Some lady apparently praised his noble forehead. And Beethoven, bold as brass, just offered it to her for a kiss.
Wow. Direct. Maybe a little awkward.
Totally captures that directness, yeah. What about the shaving incident you mentioned earlier? The messy one.
Oh, right, with his pupil Ferdinand Ries.
That's the one. Beethoven shaving, gets soap everywhere, then enthusiastically embraces Ries, transferring soap all over Ries's face in the process.
Oh, dear.
But the article says they both just laughed about it. Shows that warmth, that humor, even in the middle of a potentially awkward, messy moment.
Nice moment of connection. Okay, and then there's the famous or infamous visit from Major General Kidd in 1816. That one shows a different side.
Oh, it certainly does. It's a classic example of his fierce artistic integrity and that explosive temper. So Kidd finds Beethoven shaving, cuts, soap, the whole scene, and then he makes a big mistake.
What did he do?
He offered Beethoven money to compose a symphony, but specifically one in an older style, like Haydn or Mozart.
Asking Beethoven to basically imitate someone else.
Exactly. Beethoven was absolutely furious, just livid, rejected the offer instantly, very angrily. Later, he claimed he'd actually thrown him downstairs.
Thrown him downstairs.
Wow.
Literally.
Well, whether he physically chucked the general or just, verbally destroyed him is up for debate. But it perfectly shows how intensely he refused to compromise his art. No going backwards.
It really highlights that rebellious spirit you mentioned, even against a potential patron. He also had quite a robust, sometimes crude sense of humor, especially in casual settings.
Very much so. Loved his evenings at the pub, drinking wine or beer, eating simple stuff like cheese and kippers, reading the papers.
Sounds quite normal, actually.
Yeah, but then there's a story where he sees a man with an ugly face in the pub. Beethoven just gets up and leaves, declaring the man rascally.
Huh. No filter whatsoever.
None. And his language could be pretty rough, even with friends.
Like with Schimpanzee.
Oh, yeah. He was notoriously crude to the violinist Ignaz Schimpanzee. Called him a wretched dog, told him not to come back, stuff like that. Even in letters, like one to his brother Johann, he'd use swear words, calling people things like the housekeeper's arch-pig or a miserable scoundrel.
It shows a very raw, maybe unpolished side to him.
Definitely not smoothed over by social niceties. But you mentioned moments of tenderness, too. It wasn't all temper and crudeness.
No, exactly. The anecdotes aren't all negative. Remember the story about the notes he scribbled on window shutters in Baden?
Vaguely. What happened?
Well, the landlord apparently sold them off as valuable autographs. And when Beethoven found out, the article says he was just amused by it.
Really? Not angry?
Apparently not. Shows a lighter side, maybe less volatile than you might expect sometimes.
That's good to hear. And the nickname for Gerhard von Breuning, that one's quite sweet. It really is lovely. He affectionately called the young boy Trouser Button.
Trouser Button?
Because the boy used to cling to him, apparently. Just followed him around, holding on. That simple nickname, it shows such a capacity for warmth, for tenderness, right alongside the famous grumpiness.
It really rounds out the picture, doesn't it? Shows the complexity. He also had a sharp wit, maybe a bit cynical sometimes, politically.
He did. There's that famous quip where he predicted there'd be no revolution in Vienna as long as the Austrians had their beer and sausages.
Huh. A bit cynical, but probably insightful.
A humorous take on basic needs versus political ideals.
So this mix, the wit, the warmth, the explosive temper, the bluntness, it really does bring him to life. Okay, so we've covered his physical presence, his daily habits, those core personality traits, and some really vivid anecdotes. Looking at all these details, mostly from the popular Beethoven article via Marion Scott's work,
Mm.
why does all this matter? What does it add to how we understand this huge figure?
Well, I think it matters enormously because it pulls him down from the pedestal of just abstract genius and puts him right here in the messy, complicated human world. It shows us the whole person.
Flaws and all.
Exactly. The contradictions, the struggles, the flashes of humor, the difficulties. The person who is somehow capable of creating this incredibly powerful, often beautifully ordered music. It makes the legend relatable somehow.
And maybe gives us insight into the creative process itself.
I think so, yeah. These details hint at the sheer energy inside him, the intensity. The same fire that maybe made him impatient or difficult was likely the same fire that powered the revolutionary force of his compositions. It feels like the man's own turbulent inner and outer world was just inseparable from the sublime order and deep emotion he forged in his music.
It definitely makes you think about the music differently, knowing more about the person wrestling it into existence.
It really does.
So to wrap up this deep dive then, we've explored Ludwig van Beethoven not just as the composer we all know, but as this fascinatingly complex, intensely human individual. Striking appearance, vibrant, often challenging personality.
And these details, these glimpses from historical accounts, brought together in sources like the popular Beethoven article building on Marion Scott's research, they really help us connect with the man behind the enduring myth. It paints a much richer picture.
Absolutely. Which leaves us, and leaves you, with a final thought to mull over, building on all this. Considering the sheer intensity, the contradictions of his personality and his physical presence, this whole inner and outer world we've glimpsed today, how deeply do you think the man himself, in all his complexity, shaped the revolutionary music he created?